All right, so this is part 3 for week 11, the Dust Bowl. So we're going to finish up this lecture with another case study on land degradation. Now, a lot of times when people talk about desertification, they think about issues outside of the United States, like the Sahel that we talked about, or another big one right now is going on in Western China, where we're seeing increased desertification. But that's also something that's happened here. And the Dust Bowl is probably one of the more famous examples. And so you're going to watch a video this week that kind of goes into it in great detail. But just to kind of sum it up, um, the Dust Bowl was the accumulation or the accumulation of many things. That by the 1930s, much of the Midwest of the United States was covered by dust and desert. This is a picture, and this is in the area of Kansas. So not the whippling fields of wheat that we thought. And this was a combination of many things, but it profoundly affected America. So what happened is this area right here was the core of that worst damage we showed you. So Kansas, Oklahoma. But the effects were felt all through the Midwest. And large numbers of farmers had to leave. Their farms were gone, covered in dust and dirt. And one of the major migrations was here along Highway 66 to LA and California. So during the 1930s, California's population skyrocketed um, for all of this. So what caused the Dust Bowl? Why were people living there to begin with? Well, the first thing, let's talk about before people even came there. The whole area out here in the west, there's large areas here in the Great Plains that are grasslands, but underneath the dirt is actually sand. Thousands of years ago, when the glaciers came through in the last ice age, they pushed all this sand down here, and then over time it got buried. So it's not exactly just black dirt, it's very dry sand, which would be like a desert. It's just it's got a thin layer of dirt on top. And the other issue is the climate. So as you move further west in the United States, it just generally gets drier. There's less rain every year. But the problem is that this is variable. This level of rainfall can fluctuate quite rapidly. So for 5 or 10 years, it could be much wetter, which would fool you into thinking that it's wetter than it is, but then it could be dry. Not coincidentally, this is the same area right here, very close by, where the Anasazi lived. So rainfall is it fluctuates, kind of fickle. And then land use. So before white people lived there, it was just the prairie, wide open grasslands with buffalo. Um, Not enough water or rain to grow a lot of trees, and the grass was kind of short. But people came and farmed because if you can grow grass, they thought you should be able to grow wheat or corn, and you did. But the issue was climate, right? The climate had been much wetter. So beginning in the 1880s through about the 1920s, it was much wetter, which allowed much easier crops to be grown. And beginning in the 1920s, that changed, as we'll talk about. And the last thing was crop prices. So farmers had been moving into this area in the 1880s, but right after World War II ends in 1918, right here, as most of Europe was in a war, they weren't growing crops. They were too busy fighting. Also, their armies needed to eat. So there was this huge demand for food. And so the price of wheat just goes through the roof, which encouraged more people to move and grow wheat because that was the new future. So you have these things all combined, right? You have the human aspects of increased prices for wheat. You have the climatological fluctuation of rain, and you have the geological factors under the ground. And what happens is it all comes crashing down. Let's go back to that map with price. So the price for wheat skyrockets, but then in the early 1920s it drops dramatically because there's too much wheat. People have grown so much, the cost goes down. So now these farmers are making very little money. And what happens? If you're making less per ton, if you're only getting 10 cents per ton of corn, you're making less money. So what do? You try to grow more corn. And so as prices dropped, people began to farm more and more or expand their farming. Well, the problem with this, as we mentioned before, is usually you start with the best land. If you expand, it's probably not as good of land to farm. If it was really good land, you would have farmed it in the first place. So they're expanding into marginal land that maybe isn't the best suited for agriculture. And then the climate changes. We start entering a period of extended droughts in the late 1920s. And so now you have overextended farmers growing too much food because to make a profit instead of poverty, and then the rains stop. And what happens is the crops dry up and the ground gets bare, so much so that the crops basically wilt away and there's very little ground cover left, which exposes the sand. The wind comes, and now you start seeing sandstorms, huge sandstorms that basically start turning this area into a desert. Okay, so all these things, and then just when it got better in 1929, you have the Great Depression and more drought, so even more economic downturn, right? And what's left behind is drought and dust, and what was once profitable green farmland is covered in dust and dirt, and farmers lose their livelihoods and have to move anywhere they can find work to the East Coast, to the West Coast. Whole areas just people leave. The population plummets in states like the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska. Well, what happened since then? So afterwards, there were some lessons learned, and one thing they learned was to reduce runoff. And what happens is this: when you have that exposed land, if you have a bad crop and the corn dies in the field, and now you have this big open dirty field, and now you have rain falling, that rain washes away that dust and dirt, and it makes even more land exposed. So if you can reduce the runoff, slow it down, and so they started planting crops in a different way. They started what they call contour planting. So here, if you notice the crops, they're not in a straight line; they kind of follow the curve of the hill. That's because all these little ridges act like little dams. So when the water rain falls, it doesn't just run straight down the hill. It kind of acts like almost like a sponge to help soak it up. The other thing you can do is reduce the wind, and farmers were encouraged to plant taller crops between shorter crops to kind of get into the air a little bit, like a windbreak we talked about. Sometimes they were given to plant trees between farm fields, so slowing the wind, reducing the runoff, and this would kind of mitigate the effects. Another thing was to reduce erosion. It used to be you would plant the field, you would come through at the end of the fall, you'd cut your crops out, leave bare earth. But now they were taught leave a little bit behind. Maybe leave the stubble, the stumps. Maybe don't cut everything down. And that acts like a ground cover blanket, helps keeping the soil in place and exposing less to dust storms. A big lesson was a lot of that land was never refarmed like this. If the land isn't suitable for growing crops, the soil's too sandy, or it's not enough rain, then maybe you should switch to a different use, like grazing cattle, which isn't as intensive, or letting it just be natural forest land again. And so all of these steps together have led to a recovery. Now, the Chinese Dust Bowl is going on right now. We're overshadowed with the current events of the coronavirus. But in western China, there's a very dry area in the middle of Asia. Very similar conditions to the Dust Bowl. The Chinese population is increasing. There's a lot of people who are poor and want to farm more land and make more money. The climate is changing. And all of these, this is an actual picture, these huge sandstorms are just burying small cities. And the Gobi Desert in the middle of Asia is just gradually creeping up. So, what are the dustiest places on Earth? I think I should have some music. The dustiest places on Earth. First one here, the Bodeli Depression. So right here in Central Africa, this is the Sahara Desert. This is was at one point an ancient lake, which one of your video talks about. So this is a very kind of like a bowl, very shallow bowl, very, very dry, very, very dusty. And I found this picture from your book. This is an actual picture on the ground during a dust storm. Another one, and by the way, these dustiest places, you might notice the caption, Dead and Dying Seas. This was at one point an actual lake, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Owens Lake in Los Angeles is no longer there. It was right here. Now, Owens Lake was drained for Los Angeles. So Los Angeles, California, LA, Hollywood is actually in a very dry area. It doesn't have enough water to sustain the population naturally. And as the city was growing in the 1920s and 30s, they began taking water from lakes all over Chicago, California. They would dig a big, huge ditch and put a pipe, like a straw, And so they take water here from Mono Lake, and this was Owens Lake. This is from Central California. You can't see it, but there's one here underneath my picture, right here, that goes to the Colorado River. But Owens Lake was once a very large lake. And in the early 1920s, it was basically drained. The water was sucked out so that Los Angeles could have a drink, and it's no longer there. Today, this is what it looks like. So it's the bottom of a lake. It's dusty, it's dry, it's sandy, and any kind of wind that goes through here just whips this up and blows it up. It's usually, if you measure the air quality, which is what this is, it has the highest amount of dust in the air anywhere in North America. Probably the saddest one is the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea right here is in the middle of Asia. This was, up until about maybe the 1990s to the year 2000, this was the fourth biggest body of water in the world, behind the oceans and the Great Lakes, right? And today, it's almost gone. It's dried up. So in the course of a human lifetime, from this to that. So it's right here in the middle of Asia. This is a historical event. Why is it drying up? So all the water that fills this lake, or the sea, comes from a couple major rivers. These are the Himalayan mountains here. And water flows through these rivers, through this area, into the lake. This area is actually, without these rivers, is a desert. It's hot, it's dry. But because the mountains have snow in the winter, that feeds these lakes. Now this land around here, because it's hot and dry, it limits what you can grow for agriculture. But scientists in the Soviet Union, this used to be part of the Soviet Union, said if we were to build canals for irrigation, take water out to water the crops, we could make the desert bloom. And in fact, what they grow here now is cotton. Cotton is very profitable. It makes a lot of money, but it takes a lot of water. In fact, you can see right here, here's a big, huge canal right here. They take so much water for growing the crops, there was less water going into the Aral Sea. And the problem is, because it is so hot and so dry, and there's no other source of water, that the less water coming in, it just starts to evaporate, to where today it's gone. Now, this for years was one of the largest bodies of water. People for generations, huge fishing industry. A lot of people used it for their livelihoods. But as it dried up, literally the boats came to rest on the bottom of the lake. So this whole sea was once, a large body of water, bigger than the Great Lakes. And now it's dry, it's dusty, it's a desert. People who were fishermen have lost their lives. It's had many different effects. All of the pollution that was in that water settled to the bottom of the ocean. Well, now the ocean's dried up, the lake's dried up. All the pollution that was in that mud, which is now sand, whenever a sandstorm comes by, is blown up in the air. And the rates of lung cancer in this area have gone through the roof in the last 20 years. And any kind of respiratory disease is skyrocketed. And then the last thing has been kind of an unintentional side effect. It's made the climate much more extreme. Because if I go back a couple slides, this is actually mainly a desert. So this is a large body of water in the middle of the desert. So right around here in the summer, because it was cooler, just like Lake Michigan makes us cooler, it was cooler near the lake. So it kept the temperature in this region relatively cooler and a little bit warmer in the winter. But now that it's gone, in the summer it gets hotter faster. In the winter it gets colder faster. So the temperature from being very mellow, being from warm to cold, now goes from hot to cold much faster. And this has had a really devastating effect on the actual crops they try to grow. So they're in this process now of trying to devise how do they bring the water back, but without destroying the livelihoods of those who now live there farming cotton. And it's a tough balancing act, and by no means done. So that's all we have for desertification and land degradation. Don't forget to go through, do the Cahoots quiz before next class for this chapter. Don't forget to watch the 2 movies and answer the questions with the discussion prompt that I asked for. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments on this video, I'd love to hear what you got to say. If you have anything else, I will see you in virtual class. Have a good week. Stay inside. Wash your hands.